Ladies and gentlemen, imagine two of the world's most powerful nations standing on a bridge they've spent decades building. Trade deals, defense pacts, technology exchanges, cultural ties. And now, cracks begin to show. The wind of mistrust blows through, voices grow louder, and the question echoes across boardrooms, newsrooms, and living rooms. Who's to blame? But here's the twist. Sometimes the real danger isn't in the cracks themselves. It's in our obsession with finding someone to push into them. When something breaks, whether it's a relationship, a business deal, or a partnership between two nations, the first thing people want to know is, whose fault is it? We love that question. We crave it. We can't help ourselves because blame is easy. It's a shortcut. It lets us feel like we've solved the puzzle without actually looking at all the pieces. But the truth, blame is the cheapest currency in human behavior. It's easy to spend, and it never buys you the truth. We're wired for it. We've been pointing fingers since the beginning of time. Adam said, it was her. Eve said, it was the serpent. Nations say, it was them. And while everyone's busy pointing, no one is fixing. See, when you blame, you hand away your power. You put the keys to your future in someone else's hands. And if they don't want to change, you're stuck in the same place, staring at the same problem. Now let's talk about this so-called fallout between India and the United States. The temptation is to make it simple. Pick a side. Label one the victim, the other the aggressor. Wrap it up in a neat little package so you can sleep at night. But real life isn't neat. Politics isn't neat. History isn't neat. You can't put decades of layered trust, strategy, suspicion, and negotiation into a one-sentence verdict. This isn't a boxing match where there's a clear winner and loser when the bell rings. This is a dance between two massive, proud, strategic partners, sometimes stepping on each other's toes, sometimes moving in perfect sync, and sometimes walking off the floor altogether. See, misplaced blame is like trying to diagnose a fever without checking what caused it. You can hand someone medicine, but if you don't treat the infection underneath, it'll be back, stronger than before. Nations are no different. If we just say, they broke it, we don't actually understand how it broke. And if we don't understand that, we're doomed to watch it break again. People forget these two countries, India and the US, haven't been in some perfect honeymoon phase since day one. The foundation has been tested before. There were moments in history where they stood far apart. Different political systems, different priorities, different friends in the geopolitical playground. There were moments where trust was a whisper, not a roar. Yet here we are, decades later, talking about a fallout. That means somewhere along the way there was connection. There was common ground. You don't call it a fallout unless something valuable existed before. And that's why the blame game is so dangerous here. Because when the world watches two global powers drift apart, the easy narrative becomes, they failed. But what if, instead, the real story is, they stumbled? There's a big difference. Failure is final. Stumbling means you can still get up, brush yourself off, and keep moving, maybe even stronger than before. Now let's go deeper into the reality of these relations, because this isn't just about emotions or misunderstandings. This is about history. And history isn't a straight line. It's a winding road filled with sharp turns, wrong exits, and sometimes detours that last for years. During the Cold War, India walked a tightrope, balancing between superpowers, fiercely guarding its independence. The US, meanwhile, was playing its own global chess game, aligning with whoever fit the strategy at the moment. That created years of cautious interaction. There wasn't blind trust. There wasn't blind loyalty. There was careful calculation. Then came the shift. Trade began to flow more freely. Defense deals were signed. Technology partnerships grew. Cultural exchanges expanded. Suddenly, two nations that once eyed each other from a distance were shaking hands, smiling for the cameras, talking about a strategic partnership. But here's the thing about partnerships: the closer you get, the more you see the cracks. The public doesn't always see those cracks forming. They see the speeches, the press conferences, the deals announced with great fanfare. But behind closed doors, there are disagreements. There are mismatched expectations. The US might want faster alignment on certain policies. India might want more respect for its independent decision-making. That's not betrayal. That's the reality of two sovereign nations protecting their own interests. And if you expect anything else, you're living in a fantasy. This is where perception plays its dangerous game. A delayed agreement becomes proof of distrust. A diplomatic disagreement gets spun as evidence of betrayal. Before long, the public stops seeing partnership and starts seeing opposition. That's how mistrust spreads. Not always because of what's actually happening, but because of how it's being framed. And the lesson in that is powerful. Not just for governments, but for us as individuals. How many times have you fallen out with someone, not because of what they did, but because of how you perceived what they did? You got a text you thought was cold. They missed your call, and you assumed they were ignoring you. In reality, they might have been dealing with something you knew nothing about. Yet your perception became your truth, and that truth shaped your actions. Nations do the same thing. So before we go pointing fingers, we have to acknowledge this: in a relationship as complex as India-US ties, there is never a single architect of tension. Both sides shape the outcome, and both sides bring their history, their priorities, their pride, and their fears to the table. And both sides make decisions they believe are right for them, even if it doesn't sit well with the other. Now, some might say, well, one side should have compromised more. But compromise isn't a one-way street. You can't ask someone to give up what they see as their core interest and still expect them to call it partnership. That's not partnership. That's submission. And submission breeds resentment, not unity. Here's where we need to elevate our thinking. Blame will always be the tool of the impatient. It's for people who want quick answers without doing the hard work of understanding. But understanding, that's where the power is. When you understand why something happened, you can prevent it from happening again. When you understand both sides of the story, you can see pathways that blame would have blinded you to. If you look at the history between India and the US, you'll see moments where both made bold moves to close the gap. Sometimes those moves paid off, sometimes they didn't. But they made them. That's what matters, because it shows there was intent. And intent can be rebuilt if there's courage on both sides. So what do we do with this so-called fallout? We don't turn it into a crime scene looking for the culprit. We turn it into a classroom looking for the lesson. We ask, what were the signs? Where did the communication break down? What assumptions got in the way? How can we ensure next time those cracks get repaired before they split the bridge in two? If you've ever been in a position where you had to rebuild trust, whether with a person, a team, or an entire community, you know it's not quick, and it's not easy. It requires humility. It requires patience. It requires both sides being willing to sit in a room and not just talk, but listen. Not just defend their positions, but genuinely try to understand the others. That's the kind of work that can turn tension into opportunity. And that's where real leadership shows up. Not when things are going smoothly, but when the waters are rough and everyone's looking for someone to steady the ship. So yes, it's tempting to ask who's to blame for the India-US fallout. But maybe the better question is, who's willing to step up and fix it? Because the answer to that question will shape not just the future of these two nations, but the balance of power, the flow of trade, and the stability of entire regions. This isn't small. This isn't just political drama. This is history being written in real time, and the pen is in both their hands. And if you've been listening closely, you'll notice something else. The principles that can fix this at the international level are the same ones that can fix things in your own life. Stop looking for who to blame. Start looking for how to rebuild. Stop obsessing over the cracks. Start strengthening the foundation. Because whether you're talking about friendships, families, businesses, or nations, the same truth applies. Blame builds nothing. Understanding builds everything. Perception is a strange thing. It's not always the truth. It's not always the facts. It's the version of reality we carry in our heads. And in diplomacy, perception can be more dangerous than the actual problem. Two leaders can walk out of a room having had the exact same conversation, but each leaves believing something entirely different happened. Why? Because they don't just hear the words. They filter those words through years of history, national pride, personal agendas, and the fear of being taken advantage of. When India and the United States sit across the table, they're not just talking as two people in a meeting. They're speaking as two nations with decades of baggage, triumphs, and scars. One side may see a proposal as an opportunity for cooperation. The other may see it as a strategic trap. One side may call it a partnership, while the other quietly wonders if it's an attempt to pull them into someone else's orbit. Now, here's the problem. Once that perception takes root, it starts to grow. It doesn't stay quiet. It begins to influence decisions. It begins to shape the way future offers are made, the tone of official statements, the pace of negotiations. And before you know it, what was once a minor misunderstanding becomes a deep mistrust. Not because either side intended harm, but because both sides began to interpret every move through the lens of suspicion. This is why the media's role becomes so critical and so dangerous. The media doesn't just report events. It frames them. It decides which sentences get repeated, which gestures get magnified, and which context gets left out. A single headline can undo months of careful diplomacy. A single leaked remark can harden positions that might otherwise have softened over time. And once the public starts believing a certain narrative, it becomes harder for leaders to act against it without appearing weak. But here's where the deeper truth comes in. This isn't just about politics. This is human nature. How many times in your life have you let someone else's opinion of a situation become your truth? How many times have you been convinced someone was against you, only to later find out they weren't even thinking about you? That's the power of perception. It's not just what's real. It's what you believe is real. And that belief can shape your actions more than reality itself. So in the case of India and the United States, when disagreements happen, and they will happen, the challenge isn't always the disagreement itself. It's managing how that disagreement is perceived. If it's framed as two strong allies ironing out differences, the public remains calm, trust stays intact, and the door stays open. If it's framed as two countries on the verge of breaking ties, then even minor issues can spiral into a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that brings us to something most people don't like to hear in relationships this complex. No single side is ever entirely right or entirely wrong. Shared responsibility isn't a political statement. It's a fact of life. When you've got two parties with their own goals, their own priorities, their own insecurities, and their own vision of the future, both sides will make moves that sometimes help and sometimes hurt the relationship. Think about it like two people carrying a heavy table. If it falls and smashes to the ground, you can argue all day about who lost their grip first. But the reality is, you were both holding it. You both had the chance to adjust, to communicate, to keep it steady. Blaming just one person doesn't change the fact that both were part of the situation. Nations are no different. And yet, here's where ego enters the picture. Nations have pride just like people do, sometimes more. No leader wants to admit fault, because in politics, fault can be weaponized. So instead of open admission, you get defensive statements, carefully worded press releases, and public gestures designed to save face. But behind closed doors, there's a different conversation happening. One where both sides quietly know they could have handled things better. If you've ever been in a moment where you knew you had a part to play in a breakdown, whether in your family, your career, or your community, you know that it takes real courage to own it. To say, yes, I made a mistake, and I'm willing to make it right. That's not weakness. That's the strongest move you can make, because it shifts the energy from protecting pride to solving the problem. In the global arena, shared responsibility means shared opportunity. If both nations can say, we each contributed to this tension, then both nations can also say, we each have the power to fix it. That's when the dynamic changes. That's when negotiations aren't just about what you get, but what we build. But here's the thing. You can't get to that point without first controlling the narrative. You can't step into a room with open hands if the world thinks you're there to throw punches. That's why the perception problem is so dangerous. It poisons the ground before seeds of cooperation can be planted. And unless both sides are actively managing how their moves are seen, not just what they actually are, they'll find themselves in a cycle of mistrust that no amount of agreements can truly fix. Let's take a step back and really picture it. Two negotiators are sitting across from each other. They've both been told, in their own circles, be careful. They're not as committed as they say they are. That seed of doubt is already planted before the first word is spoken. So when one says, we'll need more time to review this, the other doesn't hear caution, they hear resistance. When one says, we have to prioritize other commitments right now, the other doesn't hear scheduling, they hear stalling. Every phrase is colored by suspicion. And suspicion doesn't just slow progress. It changes the tone entirely. You can't build trust in an environment where every gesture is dissected for hidden meaning. You can't strengthen a partnership if every delay is treated as a betrayal. That's why successful diplomacy isn't just about policy. It's about psychology. It's about understanding how the other side sees the world, and then working to bridge that gap in perception before it turns into a chasm. Now, let's talk about responsibility on a personal level. If you're in a position of influence, whether in your job, your family, your friendships, you know that you can't control how people interpret everything you say. But you can control the clarity of your intention. You can control how consistent you are. You can control whether your words and your actions line up. Because when they don't, you create space for misunderstanding. And in that space, suspicion grows. The same rule applies here. If India and the United States want to avoid falling deeper into mistrust, they have to make sure their intentions are unmistakable, not just in what they say privately, but in what they demonstrate publicly. That consistency becomes the foundation for rebuilding confidence. Without it, even the best agreements will eventually crumble under the weight of doubt. So, when we ask, who's responsible for this fallout, the honest answer is both. Not in a cynical everything is equal way, but in the sense that both have been active participants in shaping the current state of affairs. And because they've both had a hand in it, they both hold the tools to fix it. But fixing it means doing something that's rare in politics, choosing humility over victory. It means stepping into the conversation not with the question, how do we prove we were right, but with the question, how do we make this right? That's a completely different posture. And that posture is the one that builds not just deals, but durable trust. If you've ever seen two people reconcile after a long and bitter argument, you know it's not about one side suddenly admitting the other was perfect. It's about both realizing that holding on to pride was costing them more than the fight was worth. In that moment, the scoreboard stops mattering. The goal changes. And in the context of two global powers, that change in goal isn't just good for them. It's good for the entire world watching. Because the truth is, this fallout isn't happening in isolation. Other nations are watching closely, reading every sign, analyzing every word. Some are allies hoping for a resolution. Others are competitors looking for cracks they can exploit. And that's why managing perception, accepting shared responsibility, and choosing to rebuild together isn't just about repairing a relationship. It's about securing influence, stability, and credibility on the world stage. And for anyone listening who thinks this is just about big politics, remember this: the principles that can heal a rift between nations are the same ones that can heal a rift in your own life. Don't get trapped in the cycle of misreading intentions. Don't let suspicion become your default lens. Don't get so caught up in proving a point that you lose the person or the opportunity on the other side. Because once that door closes, you may not get another chance to walk through it. Accountability is a word people like to throw around, but few are willing to live by it. It's easy to demand it from others, but uncomfortable when the mirror turns toward us. Nations are no different. Leaders can stand at a podium and call for transparency, fairness, and trust. But those words only mean something when backed by the courage to admit what could have done better. That's not weakness. That's maturity. That's the sign of a nation that understands that power without self-reflection eventually collapses under its own weight. When two countries as influential as India and the United States hit a rough patch, there's always the temptation to harden positions, to protect pride, to double down on your own story. But self-reflection isn't about surrendering your stance. It's about asking the tough questions that keep you from repeating the same mistakes. It's about saying, where did we misunderstand each other? Where did we move too fast? Where did we fail to communicate clearly? Those questions take courage, because they require admitting you didn't have it all figured out. And here's the thing. Self-reflection in diplomacy isn't just about looking back at what went wrong. It's about looking forward with a sharper, clearer vision. You can't chart a better path if you won't admit the last one had potholes. Both India and the United States have to understand that this isn't just about repairing a relationship, it's about evolving it. The world doesn't stand still. Economic landscapes change. Security threats evolve. Technology reshapes industries overnight. A partnership that worked 5 years ago might not fit the reality of today. That's why reflection is critical. It allows you to adapt without abandoning the foundation you've built. In personal life, it's the same. You might have friends, colleagues, or family members where something shifted. You don't just ask, what happened? You ask, what can we do differently next time? Because without that forward-looking mindset, you're doomed to circle back to the same arguments, the same disappointments, the same breakdowns. Nations can fall into that loop just as easily. When two powerful players take a step back, the rest of the world starts speculating. Some will hope they come back stronger. Others will try to fill the space left behind. That's why the ability to own your part in a fallout is so important. It's not just about dignity, it's about control. If you can't own your mistakes, someone else will write the story for you. And that story may not be the truth. Now, the natural question is, once you've reflected, once you've taken accountability, what's next? That's where vision comes in. Too often, conflicts between nations are treated like dead ends, but history shows us they can be turning points. In fact, some of the strongest alliances in the world today were forged out of moments of tension. Disagreement forces you to see where your interests align and where they don't. It forces you to re-evaluate priorities and clarify expectations. If done right, those hard conversations can lead to a partnership that's more resilient than the one before. It's about perspective. You can look at a fallout as the collapse of something important, or you can look at it as a test that reveals how strong the foundation really is. If the connection was shallow, it'll crumble and fade into history. If the connection was deep, it will survive the storm, because both sides will see the value in protecting it. That's where opportunity hides, in the decision to rebuild, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that both are better together than apart. This is where leadership becomes more than speeches and handshakes. Leadership is about making the harder choice when the easier one is to walk away. It's about saying, we're not done. We may be bruised, but we're not broken. And we're willing to put in the work. That attitude changes everything. It turns suspicion into dialogue, distance into progress. Turning fallout into opportunity requires both vision and patience. You can't rebuild trust overnight, and you can't expect the other side to leap forward without hesitation. Trust is not something you demand. It's something you earn. And earning it means showing up consistently, even when progress is slow, even when the headlines are skeptical, even when the voices on both sides say, why bother? You bother because the bigger picture is worth it. And that's something both India and the United States have to keep front and center. The bigger picture. The truth is, these two nations share more common ground than differences. Their economic interests, security goals, and technological ambitions align in ways that many other partnerships simply can't match. They have overlapping values about democracy, innovation, and global stability. That shared foundation is the reason why this fallout isn't the end. It's a chapter, not the whole book. But here's where the work comes in. If they want to turn this tension into a stronger alliance, they can't just patch over the cracks and pretend nothing happened. They have to address the root issues openly and directly. They have to be willing to hear uncomfortable truths about how each side's actions have been perceived. And they have to agree on a path forward that isn't just about avoiding conflict, but about actively building something better. In our own lives, we face the same choice. When trust breaks, we can either walk away or we can use the moment to deepen the relationship. And deepening it means being willing to change. Not who you are, but how you approach the connection. It means realizing that your way isn't the only way. It means finding the space where both sides can win without feeling like they've lost themselves in the process. That's the kind of mindset that turns setbacks into comebacks. It's the mindset that says, we can be stronger because of this, not in spite of it. And the truth is, some bonds only reach their full strength after they've been tested. Steel isn't forged in comfort. It's forged in heat. Relationships, whether between people or nations, are the same. The heat reveals what's solid and burns away what's weak. If both India and the United States step into this moment with humility, courage, and clarity, they can create something that outlasts the headlines and the temporary shifts in global politics. They can show the world what real partnership looks like. Not perfection, but persistence. Not unbroken harmony, but unbreakable commitment. That's the lesson people remember. And for anyone listening, that's your takeaway too. Don't see your fallouts as the end of the road. See them as checkpoints, moments that force you to slow down, reevaluate, and adjust your course. Because when you handle them with honesty and intention, they can lead you somewhere better than where you started. What these two nations have right now is a choice. They can keep looking backward, counting every grievance, keeping score like two rivals locked in a game that no one wins. Or they can turn forward, look each other in the eye, and decide that the next chapter is going to be about building, not breaking. And if they do, they won't just repair a relationship. They'll set an example for the world. An example that says real power isn't in dominating the other side. It's in walking side by side, stronger than before,